This mini lecture will take a look at Chapter 2, the history of management. And the reason we want to study history is so that we can learn what has worked and what has not worked for others in the past to become even better. Here are the learning outcomes for the chapter. You may pause here and read them if you choose. We're first going to start looking at scientific management, which is the study and testing of work methods in order to identify the most efficient way to complete a job. And the three people we're going to talk about in terms of scientific management are Frederick Taylor, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, and Henry Gantt. Frederick Taylor is known as the father of scientific management. He was a manager at the end of the 19th century, and he looked at two main issues that we're going to talk about that he looked at were soldiering and rate busters. Soldiering occurred when workers deliberately slowed their pace in order to restrict their output. So they did things slower so they wouldn't have to work as hard. Whereas rate busters were people who worked significantly faster than the average person. So rate busters and soldiers didn't exactly get along. So Taylor did time studies where he actually timed optimal workers or good workers to see how long it should take to complete a job. And there's a video on Canvas you can watch about him. Frank and Lillian Gilbreth were a husband and wife, and they looked to simplify work and improve productivity. So they did a motion study where they used motion picture films, which was a pretty new technology at the time to analyze jobs. And so they would break each task or job into separate motions and then try to eliminate unnecessary or repetitive movement. And so one example is they filmed bricklayers. And while they were filming, they noticed the bricklayers were wasting a lot of time by bending all the way to the ground to pick up the bricks. So they introduced the idea of scaffolding or using a shelf that was about at waist height so they wouldn't have to bend over, which increased productivity and was better on the workers' bodies. Henry Gantt came up with the Gantt chart, and it's just a graphical chart that shows which tasks need to be completed in what order and at what time. And these are still used today. It's a very popular concept in project management. And here's just an example of a Gantt chart. If you haven't used one already in your career, you most likely will. I use them when I do projects myself. So scientific management is still used today, and I'll just give you some examples. Companies such as Amazon, McDonald's, and FedEx utilize this theory to maximize employee performance or systemize workplaces, tools, and procedures in order to be more efficient and effective. And so you can read all about these if you'd like to pause here as well. Next, we're going to move on to bureaucratic management. Max Weber was was really the person who spearheaded this. At one time, people were given jobs or power based on who they were, what family they were born into. Think of a kings and queens and prince and princesses. And what Max Weber said is, look, people should be given control based on their knowledge, expertise, and experience. And so he proposed this concept of bureaucratic management, where the goal is to achieve goals in the most efficient way possible by employing the best and most knowledgeable, the people with the most expertise and the people with the most experience. And then he also came up with these 7 elements that characterize bureaucracies. Next, we're going to talk about administrative management. And this was Henry Fayol. He was a French manager from the late 19th century. And he was pretty well known for developing the 5 functions of management, which we've kind of which have more commonly been referred to as the 4 functions of management that we talked about in Chapter 1. And he also came up with the 14 principles of management that you see on this screen. I'm not going to read them all to you, but you can review them either at this link or in your textbook. Human relations management really looked at people as assets and helping to ensure that, or I shouldn't say to ensure, but noting that workers' efforts, motivations, and their performance are affected by the work they do as well as their relationships in the workplace. And so the notable contributors to this were Mary Parker Follett, Elton Mayo's Hawthorne Studies, and Chester Barnard's theory of cooperation and acceptance of authority. So Mary Parker Follett believed in this concept of constructive conflict and coordination, rather than having one party that was dominating or got their way. And so she came up with this concept of integrated conflict resolution, where both parties indicate their preference and then work together to find an alternative that meets their needs. And this idea of compromise, where both parties give and take until they come to an agreement. Elton Hawthorne did some pretty cool studies. His first study looked at the effects of lighting and incentives on employee productivity. So they took two groups of 6 experienced female workers and separated them from the main part of the factory by a 10-foot partition. And no matter what they did, no matter how they changed the lighting or what incentives they gave, their productivity increased. And what they found from these studies was that their productivity was increasing because they had been separated from the group and now they were seen as more special. And so that feeling of being special contributed to productivity. He also did a study in a bank wiring room with 9 wiremen, 3 soldiers, and 2 inspectors. And no matter what they did, productivity dropped. And this was because the individuals in this study did not get along. And so because of that conflict, no matter what they did, productivity dropped. So his studies found that factors related to work were found to be more important than the physical conditions and showed that performance was impacted by group dynamics and group social interactions, employee satisfaction, and attitudes on individual and group performance. Next, we'll look at the cooperation of and acceptance of authority, which was proposed by Chester Barnard. And so he came up with a definition of an organization, which is a system of consciously coordinated activities or forces created by 2 or more people. And basically, he found that the willingness of employees to cooperate depended on their perception and their acceptance of authority. And so what he found is that workers need to feel that their manager can give them orders, and then they have to accept those orders. And there has to be rewards for compliance and discipline for not compliance. And workers need to respect managers based on their experience. Next, we'll look at operations management throughout history. And operations management just looks at how our daily production of goods and services, and we're trying to increase productivity, improve quality, and then manage or reduce inventories. And so here are some of the tools and methods of operations management. You can pause here to read them. One of the first major contributors to operations management was Eli Whitney, and he was a private gun contractor, and he came up with this idea that he could use standardized parts to make different guns. And so he said, look, I don't need different parts for each gun. I can make a variety of different guns with different parts. And so that's what he did. He had standardized parts and then he would just assemble them differently in order to make different guns. And another more recent company in the late 90s, early 2000s was Dell Computers. And they used interchangeable computer parts in order to make customized computers for their customers. Next was Gaspard Monge, and he came up with this idea of drawing three-dimensional objects that you could analyze them prior to making a prototype. And today we have 3D printing or 3D imaging or CAD, computer animated design, that allows us to do this. And so we would create a CAD drawing and try to find issues prior to doing a full prototype. And then lastly, Automobile Motor Works came up with this concept of hand-to-mouth inventory, or what we usually call now just-in-time inventory. And so just-in-time inventory utilizes computer information systems to determine when a specific product is either out of stock or low in stock, and then it sends a message to the inventory manager that we need more. And so that might mean that they then produce more, or they have already produced some and it's in a warehouse and so they send more. And this allows to have a much better management of inventory. And so things like just-in-time inventory really depend a lot on information management. And some things that really were instrumental in the development of information management were paper and the printing press. Then we had typewriters, then personal computers, telephones, the internet, etc. And all these things have led us to become more efficient and effective. Your book also talks about systems. And so basically systems are just, how different parts can effectively work together. And so a subsystem is just a smaller system that operates within the context of a larger system. So think of like a smaller department within a company works alongside the other departments. And when two of these subsystems work together, they can produce more than they could working apart. And then I'll let you read about closed and open systems in your text as well. And this is just a graphical view of a systems view of organization. And then lastly, we talk about contingency management. And it just really says that, look, there is no universal management theory that's most effective. And how we solve a problem or find a solution depends really on our specific situation. And so managers need to take a look at they can't quickly solve a company's problems by taking a few steps, and they need to pay attention to key contingencies which make their situation or problem unique. So today we looked at the origins of management, specifically scientific management, bureaucracy, administrative management, human relationship management, and then we discussed the history of operations, information systems, and contingency management. If you have any questions, contact me. Thanks.